Okay, thank you both for welcoming me. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here. Certainly, I see many friends here in the audience and many colleagues. And if I knew they would be here, I would have put more equations into my talk. But so I appreciated this extraordinary introduction. I just couldn't recognize myself. But I will talk about democracy and income. When Omar first asked me, he said, why don't you talk about democracy and income distribution? And I was going to do that, started preparing, but then I really wanted to talk about democracy and income. This Democracy and Income is the same title as a paper that's been published, I think in 2008, by Daron Acemoglu and co-authors in the Journal of Monetary Economics. So I'm taking that title also. For good reason, actually, because what I really want to talk about is some old theories give you a survey, but basically there is a debate going on. Let's see. A debate going on, an empirical debate, and I just come at the very end and try to sort of sort things out as best as we can. Adam Jaworski is a friend, and he is in this debate, so we thought we could help him out. The questions of the talk is, why is democracy more sustainable at high levels of income but not at low levels? This is Adam Jaworski's thesis. He has gotten a great deal of attention for it. Basically, the theory that the hazard rate of democracy is a declining function of income. So why is that? And this is what is controversial, and this is what is being contested by a number of people. And at the end, I'm going to get to the empirical debate. A lot of the theory I will summarize rather superficially, but I will try to get to the empirical issues. More specifically, the issue is driven by the question of whether what drives democracy are basic institutions, or are the institutions endogenous and they are developed due to certain fundamentals. In particular, institutions respond to income levels. You can see that this is a very old question. It goes back to Marx and Weber. Do institutions drive income and democracy, or the other way around? It's not easy to answer. The data is insufficient. And the debate is going on in a modern form, so we'll try to see where it is in empirical terms now, because a theoretical debate, I will summarize, it's like 2 decades old, the modern versions. You'll have to bear with me. The theory will be very sketchy. I will present a few theoretical issues, and it'll be abstract, and it'll not be detailed. But I'll try to give, as best as I can, an overview. And finally, as I said, I will discuss a recent paper that tries to address some of the empirical issues and highlight the difficulties in trying to resolve the issues that have been raised. But let me start, since the original topic was democracy and income distribution, let me start with what can be said about democracy and inequality. And the most obvious hypothesis is that excessive and persistent inequality leads to social conflict, and it leads to coups, and is incompatible with democracy. If you have too much inequality, you're not going to get a sustainable democracy. You need some kind of redistribution that will mediate and ameliorate democracy, the income distribution. This, of course, is way too simplistic. Because typically the governments or those in charge will do just that. They might redistribute just enough and reduce inequality just the right amount to make sure that there is no coup and the society is manageable. So you really need a bit more sophistication in the way you look at the theory. And of course, what's going to matter here are the specifics of power. It's not only that you are redistributing if you're trying to maintain a status quo. You may also be in the business of repressing. And how much of each you have to do depends on a lot of things. For instance, it does depend on the cost of collective action and the potential use of force. And the reason I have this bullet here is that looking at recent events, it looks like in many places the costs of collective action have been going down because of the social media. So there is a lot of non-stationarity in the issues we are looking at. But the main elements are still there. So political economy is going to be difficult. But empirically, what can we say? Let's start with democracy and inequality. And here is the famous paper by Alesina and Perotti. And their perspective, the question is, does income inequality increase political instability as measured by coups and strikes and demonstrations and assassinations? And the second question is, if you have political instability, does that reduce investment and growth? And their answer is yes, it does. So we know that much. So inequality is not good for growth and for investment. And here is Perotti. It's a sort of second view on this theme. First of all, two things here. First sentence, more equal societies have lower fertility rates and higher investment in education. This is sort of a different theory. It have hints of market imperfections. Why? For instance, if there is a lot of inequality, the poor may have more children to get insurance, or the poor may not be able to afford education. That's one, and therefore talented poor people will drop out of school to go to work or something. So there is that component. But the second part is that what should we expect to see in equal societies? More or less redistribution. And it may be that, in fact, in rich countries and equal countries, because there's a correlation, equal countries, you might find that there's more redistribution. And why is that? There might be more redistribution because redistribution may be mediated by a government and a welfare state, and there may be more tolerance for redistribution. And here is a point that we'll come back to, and this may be because the stakes are higher. First, you can tolerate more redistribution. We'll sort of be specific about this point because the rich can afford to redistribute some and allow it. And secondly, if you don't redistribute, there might be a coup and a revolt. The stakes are higher, so you might redistribute more. Here is Barrow, who looks at the empirical data. And what does he find? Well, the effect of inequality on investment and growth. And we will come back to the democracy issue in a little bit. Well, it turns out that inequality retards growth in poor countries and encourages it in richer countries. So we want to understand, again, why is that? Why is there a differential impact? Again, this points to the fact that maybe inequality in poor countries does cause social instability, and that's, again, consistent with what we've seen retards growth. But then in rich countries, maybe there is more tolerance for inequality as well. Why? Again, the same answer. The stakes may be too high. Now, on the other side, for those who think, well, should we disrupt the system? Shall we have a coup? Shall we have a revolution? Shall we have expropriation or appropriation? The stakes are too high because if you throw society in a frame where there is too much instability, you may end up with a bad equilibrium. So, with curtailing or growth, maybe negative growth. So, these are the sort of issues that come through considerations of inequality, and it's complicated. So inequality will sit there in the background when we try to establish a relationship between income levels and both growth and the sustainability of democracy. So inequality is always sitting there, and we will address this in a bit more specifically. So let's move on the relationship between income and the relationship of income and growth and democracy. So I'll start with growth, and then we will move on to democracy, because at least that's because my way of thinking evolved that way. You'll have to stick with me, because I'll try to sort of summarize in words a couple of theories on this topic. They're going to be very abstract. There's going to be a lot of problems with them before we move to the empirical work, but it's going to help us set some ideas. So again, the basic questions: what if property rights and institutions are endogenous? They are a function of more basic fundamentals like income. So let's think for a moment about how redistribution might take place. First, they might take place through expropriative activities, where you can have things that outside the law. It could be coups, confiscations, bribes, arbitrary taxes. So these sort of, you can classify those as expropriative activities. And then there are a bunch of appropriative redistributive activities, and you can say these are legitimate, but nevertheless they go on and they are mediated through the state. Certainly progressive income taxes, the welfare state is part of that, but there are other ways. Subsidies, regulations, wage and price controls, taxes that may be targeted to specific groups. When I was studying this, one of the things that I found was that overvalued currencies may be a redistributive mechanism that works against, say, in Argentina, it was famous, against the export sectors and agricultural goods. In Africa, it was government control of marketing boards and government monopolies that essentially withdrew income and wealth from the distant agricultural areas to the center to sustain maybe civil service or a bureaucracy. So again, one can try to list all the ways in which redistribution takes place. You can sort of put this in a tragedy of the commons framework, which I had done a number of years ago, and others did too, where you can think of it as a game, a tragedy of the commons game, where property rights, in the extreme, they are not well defined at all. You can go and grab something, and of course, how much you decide to consume and take out of the capital of the country will be excessive, because you're not taking into account the effect on others. So it's a standard tragedy of the commons dynamic game. You can put it in that framework. So the question then is, can you sustain some sort of cooperation where somehow various groups will at least resort to redistribution within the law? They will abstain from excessive appropriation. So you can ask this as a game theoretic problem: what kind of equilibrium can be sustained? And various groups will engage in expropriative or appropriative activities. Expected returns will be reduced. Growth may slow down, and may even get trapped. You may sort of get trapped at a low-level equilibrium. But this is, this sort of looking at it in this way is a little bit short-sighted, because, the agents in the economy are forward-looking. And you can ask, does it pay for various interest groups to adhere to institutional constraints and refrain from short-term expropriation so as not to endanger the growth of the economy, which will benefit everybody? So another way to say it is, can you sustain cooperation because the high short-term payoff of revolt and too high expropriation is just not worth it in the long run? Well, the twist here that we are looking for is whether cooperative actions are sustainable from income and wealth levels above a certain threshold, but not below. So this is saying, you will be able to grow faster above a certain threshold. Below that, there's going to be political instability. Maybe democracy will be endangered. The twist for game theorists here is, whether you can enforce good equilibrium or not. Typically in game theories, parameterized by the discount rate. If you're too impatient, you can't. But this is for a given discount rate, and you're looking for whether wealth levels themselves or income levels themselves are going to make a difference. Again, I'm sort of sketching this theory, and we'll do a number of these things. But suppose that you can get groups to voluntarily agree not to expropriate or revolt because the gain is not worth triggering a bad equilibrium with low and uncertain returns. And maybe you can sort of sustain a first best accumulation regime where there is some redistribution, but nevertheless you are maintaining a fast accumulation regime. But this may not be possible at low income levels, and the reason is going to be that the marginal utility of a one-time expropriation is smaller at high levels of income, and the loss associated with going to a bad equilibrium too big. But once you get to low levels of wealth, the marginal utilities are high, and people will be tempted to expropriate. So it's sort of basic insight. When you are poor and marginal utility is high, people will not be willing to wait for long-term accumulation. They may be more willing to grab something. And that might result in political upheaval. So that's one possibility. Another way to say it is rocking the boat is not worth it if you are rich, only if you are poor. You can put this in all formal terms and sort of make sure that you have a subgame perfect equilibrium, dynamic game, and all this. But you can also think that, well, suppose you can't sustain first best, you're at a low level. You can ask, what's the best you can do? What is the best equilibrium that you can sustain? That doesn't mean that you necessarily go to the worst one and you get trapped. There's something in between. Maybe you can't sustain a high growth equilibrium, but you can maybe able to sustain something better with people are not willing to deviate from, a slower growth rate. This sort of idea, you can just sort of put it in a diagram. And if you think of V hat here as the value of cooperation and VD as the value of deviating from it, and if those two things you can show that they cross, well, the whole point will be to get to the middle K there. It's KA, I believe. If you are below, how are you going to get there? Because if you are below, you are not necessarily trapped in a bad equilibrium. You might be able to sort of still grow. But here is another idea that we will relate to that will come later with recently re-articulated by Ed Glaeser. And because they are coming up with a different view, so there are three actors in the three views. There is Adam Jaworski's view, there is Taron Acemoglu, Simon Johnson, Robinson, and then Pierre Yared. That's one group. And then there's Ed Glaeser and co-authors that have another view. And this is closer, as we will see, to Ed Glaeser's view. If you think of a dictator that has some repressive measures, a growth-oriented dictator, but that can suppress deviations. It's a sort of enforced cooperation, like in Singapore, you force people to save. There are sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. By sort of, you might have a very market-oriented dictator. The one that didn't work was the Soviet Union, where you forced very high growth rates. And this will be a criticism of these theories. Why didn't it work in the Soviet Union? Because investment alone doesn't make growth. So these theories are investment-based, so we will see why. Because we know now that growth is at least in large part driven by TFP growth and technology diffusion. So we'll have to sort of incorporate this back. But if you take this at face value and you say, okay, now if I can repress society and force institutions and a market structure that is conducive to growth, I can make the value of deviation lower. So you go to K, everything above K prime, you can enforce first best because the value of deviation is lower now. So you're going to grow as in first best. But the question is, what happens when you reach KA? The repression becomes irrelevant. Beyond that, you can sustain cooperation because it's better to cooperate and not deviate. So you can sustain it. So that's when you're going to throw out the dictators. Korea is going to throw out Park. Chile is going to throw out Pinochet. they become irrelevant. So now think of Egypt. Egypt's income level is low. Will democracy be sustainable there or not? Do you need something else? Same issue is being mentioned with China. China, there's a debate, it's actually quite open about whether Chinese will revert to democracy or not. But right now, a lot of discourse is that no, it's something that we will have in the future. Right now, we have to grow. They're growing at 7.5% now. Once we get to a certain threshold, again, this view will be reflected in some of the issues that come up a little later. Here's the same idea by John Rawls in the Theory of Justice. And he's saying something very similar. He says, well, democracy and liberty is much more manageable at high levels of wealth. There comes a point beyond which there's diminishing marginal utility that sets in. And at that point, you start valuing freedom and liberty more. So I will not read it to you, but again, it's on page 543. So this is a technical digression for the technicians. If you have a theory which says that you can sustain cooperation at high income levels, but not from low income levels, there's a non-homogeneity here. Where is the non-homogeneity coming from? Are you putting it in somewhere, sneaking some non-homogeneity in? Why are people behaving differently at different income levels? Is your utility function non-homothetic or your production function non-homothetic? What's going on? And the answer to them, at least in the theory I outlined, is no, it's not true. But unless you have, one way to think about it is there's something built in there. If you have anything less than perfectly elastic labor supply, you have some diminishing returns. And that, even though production and utility is homothetic, the problem isn't. So, but again, that's a technical point. Let me go on. So we already signal the basic questions. Good institutions, what are they? Property rights, rule of law, constraint on the executive, secure cooperation and good behavior. Can the good institutions do that, or are institutions endogenous? This will keep coming up. The good institutions are only going to be in place when the self-interested groups are going to allow them to be established. So we'll get to this. So what's a problem so far? I mentioned already. All this stuff that I have mentioned is investment-based, right? So, if there's social stability, I was saying there's not going to be investment. And so first, there is the issue of TFP growth, which you might think operates independently, which is not true, of course. But second, there is the issue of technology diffusion, which is turning out to be very important in terms of explaining growth. There's no way in which certain parts of the world are going to grow and develop new technology, and it's not going to diffuse into Chad and Malawi, whether it's cell phones. Eventually, there's a locomotive effect. Now, this is another big subject about technology diffusion. There are issues about convergence clubs or so, but nevertheless, is there a political dimension to this, to how much technology growth or technology diffusion will take place? Well, Parente and Prescott's view is that yes, that the solar residual and how fast it diffuses is a political process. Again, this is yet another point, an interesting point, sort of reintroduces the idea of politics and takes the discussion away from investment towards TFP issues. So everything we've done up to this point is sort of very, very abstract. It's dynamic, and you have rational, forward-looking agents. But there is a bit of a black box about how redistribution takes place. So when I hired Adam Jaworski at NYU as dean manager, so the first thing he told me is your paper is too abstract. So why don't we sit down and make it a little bit more political? So I will quickly outline to the issue of another theory, a joint work with Adam, but I'm sort of trying to get away, sort of move quickly through the theory to come to some of the main empirical issues. So please bear with me, another theoretical discussion here. So again, the issue is going to be sustainability, not of high growth, but of democracy. Of course, the two are going to be related. So you have a model here, a sort of a theory, which says that the median voter is going to set the taxes. And if you have questions about whether the median voter theorem works in this setup, it does. Even though there are many taxes that are being set, it's not that you set one tax rate. There's a whole sequence of tax rates you're setting simultaneously, but that's another technical issue. So you have long-lived agents. They have heterogeneous in their initial wealth. And the structure is that there is an upper tail and a lower tail in this distribution. And these upper and lower tail can institute a revolt or a coup. The left is going to do it if there isn't enough redistribution, and the right is going to institute it if there's too much redistribution. Suppose you take this with a grain of salt. You say, okay, I'm going to look at such models, and if there's a revolt, there's a probabilistic outcome. You can get a left or a right dictatorship, and if this is again extreme, or if you get a right dictatorship, they are going to stop all redistribution, and if you have a left dictatorship, they are going to sort of equalize wealth. So it's an interesting twist that I thought, in the collapse of the Soviet Union, initially, all the state enterprises were sort of distributed equally, and so you start again from equality, and very soon inequality reemerges. That's sort of another interesting question, whether you can actually do something about it. And this is another sort of favorite topic of mine. If you read Pareto, Pareto's view was, no, you can't do it. I think he was right, but it's another big topic. So the other component here is, if all else being equal, everybody prefers democracy. There is a fixed cost for dictatorship. Dictators, again, I'm getting this from Adam, they always have to watch over their shoulder. It's an uncomfortable situation. Many get assassinated. There's an interesting story about Somoza in Nicaragua when he used to have elections but rig them. We will actually get to the definition of democracy. So far, I'm just going in the abstract. I'm talking about democracy, but we really have to put some specifics on what we mean by democracy, and we'll go through a variety of measures. We want to get much more concrete. But Somoza apparently told his rival after an election when he won, he said, well, you won the voting, but I won the counting. And and then he got assassinated. So what we ask with this model is, what redistributions of income and assets are feasible in democracy, given the initial assets and the redistributions? Obviously, you don't want to create so much redistribution or so little redistribution that the situation is highly unstable. You want to sort of manage it. You have to essentially redistribute enough to satisfy the poor and not too much to frustrate the rich. So the question then, the corollary question becomes, under what conditions is democracy sustainable? And the model is going to tell you, this sort of approach is going to tell you democracy is going to be sustainable in wealthy societies. So let me get a little bit more specific. So conditional on the initial income distribution, there's a threshold of income level in this model above which democracy will survive. I've sort of given you the ingredients. Again, here, agents, median voters are forward-looking, everybody's rational, everybody's optimizing fully. So the threshold is lower when you have more equality. So this is the sort of trade-off between equality and the threshold level of income that you need to sustain democracy. But the key point is that there is a level of income below which you cannot sustain democracy. You get either a right or a left coup. So in poor countries, it just doesn't pay those who can, if they well, depend on the revolutionary prowess of people, but of various groups. But if they can, they will be able to institute a coup, and then the outcome is probabilistic. But you cannot sustain democracy. And as endowments increase, the redistribution schemes that satisfy both the wealthy and the poor emerge, and they get wider. So what you get is that once you get rich, you can tolerate redistribution. Coming back to the initial questions we were talking about, how come you have more redistribution in rich countries? You can tolerate more because nobody wants to rock the boat. And it's not determinate how much you will have. It will depend on if the median voter votes, then there'll be a certain amount. But you will avoid the extremes, but the range is wider. Okay, so much for the theory now. So these are sort of some stories as to why democracy may not be sustainable at low levels of income. What are the empirical findings? I mean, there's no way I'm going to fully summarize Adam's work. This is a probit. You're going to essentially look at the probability that a democracy survives as a function of initial income. And you're going to test them against various theories. The first column is just a simple probit of transitions from democracy to dictatorship. Adam's measures, which we will get into, or the binary measures. Either you're a democracy or you're not. And the question is, will democracy survive? And then we will get more specific and then look at other measures. I'll talk more about that. So the whole idea is to try to control pairwise. I mean, this is very crude, but pairwise, if you control it, does income remain an important variable? So the transitions from democracy to dictatorship is going to be a declining function of income, and you see that they survive. When you control for education, they do. Complexity is a measure that goes to Lewis Koser about overlapping cleavages. Let me skip that one. But again, I mean, the GDP per capita is a significant determinant. Ethno-linguistic fractionalization, income survives. Political participation, voter turnout, that doesn't eliminate income. And inequality doesn't, strangely enough here. So inequality does not seem to have an impact on whether democracy is sustainable or not. Inequality, in turn, seems to be insignificant. This is very similar to Barrow's finding. There is not much of an effect on the sustainability of a political regime or on growth of inequality. So the theories go back. Of course, you can go back a very long way, but this is 1960s. Lipset, who essentially said the same thing. The general income level of a nation also affects its receptivity to democratic norms. If there's enough wealth in the country so that it doesn't take too much of a difference whether some redistribution takes place, it is easier to accept the idea that it does not matter greatly which side is in power, and so on. But so again, we are sort of working on well-defined views. So now I'm going to get a little bit more specific about the empirics. So now we have to define what we mean by democracy. And we are not going to stay, so the challenge that was posed to Adam's theory is to say, well, one of the issues was, is your definition of democracy the right one? There are all sorts of ways in which we can measure it. So let's look at a number of them, because we want to have some results that are robust. So the binary measures from Jaworski and co-authors is very, very minimalist. You have to have elections, and you have to have some reasonable turnover. And this is how much turnover and how you measure turnover is a bit controversial. That there has to be alternation in power. So this is going to be critical to resolving some of the debates. Does income really affect the sustainability of democracy or measures of democracy? The definition is going to be critical. So we'll have to get to the bottom of this. Other measures, so the polity measures. Now, these are more, not binary, more on a continuum. And you see, Jaworski would say, all of these things may be the result of democracy. That's the things that, we still have to explain, whether there's freedom of the press or whether there is competitive recruitment of an executive, all these things that are measured. He says, to me, democracy is very minimalist. The consequences are something else, but I want to see if I define it as elections and turnover. These are legitimately another view saying that, look, you can't have democracy if you don't have freedom of the press or if there is restrictions on political participation. So you are trying to form a much more nuanced measure. So this is the polity 4 measure. Freedom House is another one. A Freedom House measure, again, they have, so these are to some extent subjective. There are raters who sort of produce these indices, and there's the political rights dimension, the civil rights dimension, to sort of get a sense of the kind of questions that are answered. You see the political rights dimension. Is there corruption, or is the government open? These are sort of not, it's very subjective, but nevertheless, they do capture something. Is there freedom of the press? So these kinds of measures are different, and so we'll have to see how much of a difference they make. So now we have sort of a sense of the kind of measures that we are interested in, and we would like the theory to sort of see if any one of these theories work with all of these measures, not just one, because they are intuitive and they are highly correlated, actually. So now let me start introducing the alternative view to this view that income is going to have very influential on the sustainability of democracy. And this is the original Ajemoglu, Johnson, Robinson, and Yared article based on the 2002 article of Ajemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson. And my pronunciation of Ajemoglu is the correct one because I'm Turkish. It's Ajemoglu. And my pronunciation of Jaworski is the right one also because I learned it from him. This is a hypothesis that says, look, basically what it boils down to is really it's institution that matters. And then you have the big problem. If institutions matter, how do you know which way the causation goes? Does it go from institutions to democracy and income, or does it go the other way around? What they would like to say is really there is a critical juncture in history, something that happened 500 years ago, and then that is the point at which good institutions were established. And if good institutions were established, they persisted. And if they persisted, they caused both democracy and income, and the correlation between the two is spurious because there is this additional factor, and we can sort of instrument and explain this very well. So whether you get good or bad institutions depends on some event that happened a long time ago. And what is that event? Essentially, you can use as an instrument what the colonial powers did. What the colonial powers did, you can say, well, look, you're trying to sort of get around the endogeneity question, and you say, when colonial powers established colonies, they had two things they could do. They could just go and extract the resources and pillage the place like they did in Congo, or they could sort of colonize and establish good institutions and sustain good institutions. And that is the critical point. Once they establish these good institutions, these are going to be good predictors of what's going on today. And then they say, look, furthermore, when we use information on population density in addition to other variables, the relationship between changes in democracy and income disappears. The theory of this population density is interesting. Why should population density matter? And then they have a story that if you go and colonize a place that is densely settled, it's hard to change it. It's hard to put in new institutions, where if it's not very densely settled, then you can sort of create institutions. Okay, so this is sort of a little controversial, but it's going to be a critical variable in their theory. So now what they are going to test these theories. So now we're going to look at a few regressions before we go through the rest. Fixed effects. So in case you don't know what fixed effects are, suppose you're going to try to correlate democracy with income, but you want a proxy for institutions. You also want to put institutions, but you don't know which institutions. One of the problems with the Ajemoglu method is that, you have to force them. Which institutions are you talking about? What is it? Rather than work with those, they say, look, we're not going to specify what they are, but different countries will have different institutions. Some will be good, some will be bad, and we will proxy by putting a country-specific fixed effects. The result is that it's a very high bar that you're setting to find significance on anything else, because you're taking away all the variation that exists between rich and poor countries. So rich countries are democratic, poor countries aren't. You just throw that away. You just say, fixed effects, the country dummies are going to suck away this differences between countries. What I'm going to allow is only within country variation. Right? If a country was poor and dictatorial and then got rich and became democratic, well, that counts. But the rest is going to be eliminated, and it won't have explanatory power. And the fixed effects here are a proxy for institutions. And what happens if you were to do that? So there are lots of controls, and if you look at the line log GDP per capita, you find that as soon as you put in fixed effects, except in the first column there, which is 0.053, but significant, you start losing significance. These are various ways of doing fixed effects in dynamic panels and all this. So no matter what you do, once you put in fixed effects, suddenly income is not an explanatory variable. And the measure that is being used here is the polity measure, I believe. Okay, so it's a theory, and this is where sort of controversy starts. Essentially, the theory is it's not from democracy to income. There's this third factor that caused both, and that's institutions, and it's captured by fixed effects. If you restrict yourself to former colonies, the sample, this is a much more limited sample. Here you see that the key issue here is the change in log GDP per capita progressively declines as you add various things. Year of independence, constraints on the executive at independence, fraction Muslim, fraction Protestant, whatever that does. But really, when you really lose significance, all of that sort of weakens the relationship, but when you really lose significance with this population density variable, that seems to be the key element. So again, I suppose everybody's following. I'm just going through the first line there, change in log GDP per capita. And you see that that disappears as soon as you add in the last two columns, log population density. So Adam responds to this. So Adam's perspective is, wait a minute, what's going on here? What do? They say, well, you regress current incomes for a recent date on recent institutions and some control variables, but you have to instrument these recent institutions, and you instrument them by instrumenting for institutions at time immemorial. And what's the instrument? It's settler mortality. If colonialists died a lot, they didn't have good institutions, and if they survived, then they had good institutions. That's the methodology. There are some criticisms, but it's interesting that they get results. I mean, it's a huge new methodological advance, being able, and you can say, oh, look, it looks ridiculous to me, log settler mortality, but it works. So there is another point at which Jaworski is going to debate this. He'll say, but look, a key feature here is that whether institutions that were established 500 years ago survived. If they didn't survive, it can't be that settler mortality had any impact. So how do you check? Polity 4 data set gives you data on institutions and their quality. And you can look at, when a country at the date of independence, what quality institutions they have and what they had at exit. Exit means either up to today or when they stop being a country. Oops. So this is the quality of institutions by entry and exit years. So 1 is a high quality institution. So if you look at the first row, for example, you have 52 institutions that started as very high quality. And look how they ended. Quite a number ended up as low quality institutions. And in the same way, if you look at row 7, you have 46 countries that started at the bottom, and nevertheless, there is quite a number that are rated 1, 2, or 3. So there seems to be some churn. So there is a question as to whether, in fact, this component, the persistence of institutions, is justified. But the theory is critically based on that. Okay, so that was the criticism. Now we come to, we're going to get another hypothesis, a third hypothesis. And the third hypothesis comes from Ed Glaser. And he says, but look, settler mortality is indeed correlated with some measures of institutions that we have today. It is indeed correlated with constraints on the executive, on expropriation risk, and population density seems to be correlated with the same measure. So they do seem to have some connection, but it's not the right connection. So they're coming out with a different explanation. So they say, well, what did the settlers bring? If there is this correlation, was it the institutions, the constraints on the executives, or did they bring know-how? Did they bring human capital when they settled? If when they settled, instead of good institutions, they just brought their knowledge and their human capital, then maybe that's what accounts for their success. This know-how first resulted in high growth, and then once they got rich, they became democratic too after they crossed the threshold. So the graph says, I can correlate years of schooling in the year 2000 with settler mortality. So settler mortality is really predicting education today. And that's what did it. And then look at the last statement. So they are going back to the Jaworski view. It's Lipset, Jaworski, Barrow view, that countries first grow and accumulate capital under dictatorships. Once they become richer, they improve their institutions. Remember that graph I put? You have dictators, they suppress the costs of deviation, and then at some threshold level, you can establish good institutions. This arise endogenously once you cross a certain threshold. So this is the Glaser view. Okay, so now what are we going to do? I mean, you have all these various perspectives, some of which, I even was collaborating with Adam and wrote, so, it's confusing. So let's see what we can do. So the trick is to get technical. and sort of question the econometrics, which has been done before, but maybe there is some compromise, some resolution here. So we do two things. There's a paper by Alejandro Corvalán from Chile, and Mark Spiegel and I. And we said, look, let's first use some better data. Better in what sense? The data, the critical element, we can't just, sort of say, okay, we're going to not accept fixed effects. We're going to have to accept the fixed effects. But one of the problems of fixed effects is that it reduces the explanatory power of variables to within-country variation. So maybe if we have more data that has more within-country variation, so maybe we can recover things. So we use more recent data sets. We use Madison, a later version of Penworld tables, and look at those data, and there does seem to be, in the updated new versions, there does seem to be more within-country variation. So there's some hope that this will work. That's one issue. The second issue is, so this is a little bit more technical. A lot of these democracy measures are censored. It's binary, 0, 1. Or even the polity measure, it's 1 to 7 or something, or they are like, sort of between 0 and 1. You have censure. So you have to work with censored data. And now you have to throw fixed effects on top. And now you have a problem, because the models are nonlinear. So if you know Arellano Bond or Anderson, basically there's an instrumentation part, and then there's a differencing part. You can't difference nonlinear models. So then you have nuisance parameter problem. So you really have to, it gets messy, and you need good econometricians to consult. But there are corrections. There are things that you can do to correct that. If you put these two things together, what do you get? So you make these corrections, you use better data. Can you actually recover? But now using fixed effects, just like Ajemal Robinson and Johnson and Yared did. So we're going to do that. So there are some techniques. But sort of something to look at here is, if you look at these measures of various measures of democracies, they are sort of, like polity does seem like a binary measure, if you sort of plot it. Sort of Adam is not way off. Freedom House seems sort of concentrated at the edge. It's either democracy or dictatorship, and the middle is sort of hollow at times. I'm sorry, the horizontal axis are measures of democracy, various measures of democracy, except the Jaworski one, which is binary. So, for instance, polity gives you an index of democracy for 1 through 7. And so here you have and then we normalize it between 0 and 1 here. You see that's the various measures of democracy. They are not binary anymore. So we're going to talk a little bit at the end, before we conclude, is what's the difference? What does this mean, this technique? Okay, so now we are using fixed effects. And complication, of course, is this dynamic panel. The democracy measure today depends on democracy yesterday and income yesterday, so you have this dynamic complications. When we throw in fixed effects, well, we know, for example, under OLS, income variable is going to be insignificant, right? But I'm sorry, under OLS it's going to be significant. Once you add fixed effects now, as before, you're going to find that for two reasons. One is because you're using a different data set. Second, because you are doing Tobit now. You're doing Probit and Tobit rather than OLS. You are going to have the income variable reappear as a significant explanatory variable. The last column here, the last column is a particular correction for the nonlinearity. So you recover you recover the significance, but the statistical significance of income for the polity measure, and the same thing is another Van Hanen measure of democracy. But you're not home yet. There is a problem. Look, for example, at, I don't know, the last columns or something. Look at the magnitudes of these coefficients of income. Remember, income, by the way, is being measured as log income here. So one of the criticisms of Ajemoglu Robinson and Yared was, well, you know, even if it's significant, your coefficients are so small. And it's true, they are small. So what does it mean? It means that if you're trying to increase the democracy measure, you have to increase income by a lot. Right? 20-fold, 50-fold or something. So what do we make of this? First of all, the democracy measures like polity, so this is sort of heading towards a resolution. The democracy measures, if you look, in particular, we normalize them to be between 0 and 1, but they don't vary much. You know, countries will move from like 0.4 to 0.6, it's a big move. You know, they just don't move much in the first place, so there isn't much variation there. And then to get them, you know, to make a 0.5 move, where you can say, oh yeah, you know, this country was on a 0.25 and it moved to 0.75, really went from dictatorship to democracy. It takes a big increase in income. So that may be right. It may be, if you look at the big difference between rich and poor countries, you know, sort of the differences are 30-fold. It might be that income has to move a lot, and it's going to take a huge income shift to cross a particular threshold. What's, you know, to cross $10,000, $15,000, $20,000. Just income alone will not do it. You can sort of say, okay, but what about institutions? We have, after all, the fixed effects here. We estimated, we can actually look at the fixed effects. If those are proxying for institutions, they are also very small. Okay? So it might be that it takes a big change in income, and these countries are not growing that fast. They're growing 2-3%. It's not going to work. Now, China might work. China's been growing at 7.5%, 7,500 or 7,000 GDP. You know, 15, 20 years, they may become democratic, if you believe the theory. Okay? But the other ones, if income alone is going to do it, it's not going to work. So maybe you can say, well, there's a little bit of income, a little bit maybe institutions can be improved, but it'll take a lot. But that's not where we're going to stop. So we do this for these continuous measures, but we also do it for the binary measure. The binary measure is the Jaworski measure. Now we are going to use these binary measures. So with binary measures, we can do probit, we can do logit. What do we measure? We measure the probability that a country will become more democratic if you increase income. How will the probability change? Yeah, you look at the marginal effects, probit and logit, and you say, look, how much if I increase income by I don't know, 10%, how will that change the probability? Here, the numbers are big. We don't report marginal effects. Marginal effects are about 0.5, say. And if you take log income, you know, you're going to make a difference. You know, 10% rise in income might make a 10% change in probability. A 25% growth in income makes an even bigger effect. So you might be able to sort of say, if I look at a country, and now either you're a democracy or you're not, there's nothing in between here. The probability that you become a democracy is increasing significantly. It's not just a statistical significance. Economically, it makes a difference. The probability increases quite substantially. Okay, so now we have a puzzle. Which one is right? Yeah, so they are both right. This is, okay, so how can they both be right? You have to, you can make it right, both right in the following way. You can say, look, these measures are very different. It might be that, in fact, income doesn't make much of a difference when a country, you measure democracy, but how much more freedom of the press they have, how much more political participation they have, how have they changed their institutions to constrain the executive or to secure property rights. The income doesn't make small differences to those things. But whether they switch to an electoral system or not and have some turnover, which is a much, much weaker measure, that may be affected by income. So Jaworski may be right. You might be saying, look, as income goes up, you will see that countries are going to hold elections. China is going to become democratic. But they might still have party control. They might still have not perfect freedom of the press. So the two measures are not measuring the same thing. And maybe that's the reason why you're getting this difference on the size of the coefficient. So therefore, it's important to recognize, this sort of came late to me, but in fact, we're talking about very, very different things. It was sitting there, but, Adam's point that just, if I define a democracy as just having elections every 4 years and, every 12 years I expect to have some rotation, that might be a much weaker criterion, and that might be explained by income, but, improvements in other institutional measures, those may be much more difficult to influence, either by income or by fixed effects, fixed effects proxying for some kind of institutions. Okay? So why is democracy more sustainable at high levels of income, but not at low levels of income? That was the question. So answer one is current wealth and current democracy are both the result of early and persistent institutions that secure property and constrain the executive. That's the Tarona-Gemal view. The second view is Adam's view, and here is what we say, that democracy survives in wealthy societies. Higher incomes reduce the intensity of conflict over redistribution of income and give way to democratic institutions that, etc. So which one is right? Well, first of all, we don't have extensive data. It's hard to tell. But we think the second explanation is more likely. That's it.
Okay, now we have some time for questions. We're all pretty puzzled here, I think. Okay, Ramon.
Thanks, first of all. I think we learn a lot. And this is a very interesting issue. Just one thing I miss a little in the relation of income inequality and democracy is the issue of persistency, in the sense that I can have different unequal societies, but in one is very persistent, the inequality in where you are, and in other is not. And I think that makes a lot of difference of the attitudes respect to change and democracy. Does this thing shows up in a systematic way?
So not in what I've discussed. I sort of relegated inequality to the background. Inequality is a variable, that in the theory part at least, inequality is a variable, but it's going to make a difference, but we're sort of focusing on income levels. The results that I cited on inequality are not social mobility results. So in that sense, they fall short. So when Barrow says, well, inequality doesn't matter for growth, it might not matter for political regime, unequal regimes, democracies survive. So Ramon's point is very well taken, because inequality is much worse if it is persistent. So societies can tolerate inequality, it might simply reflect the inequality that comes from the life cycle. You know, young people are poor, older people are richer. There's an inequality there, but it doesn't matter so much because as you get older, so it's not a source of conflict. But if inequality is persistent, then that's going to cause a lot more instability, a lot more discontent. And this has not been measured, and it's a good point. And I think we shouldn't just talk about inequality, but take into account social mobility when we discuss the issue of sustainability of democracy.
It's okay. Then there is one issue that looks to be completely disregarded in this literature is the fact that we're living in a globalized world. But the analysis just analyzes as if countries were completely independent units that were developing by themselves. And then let me just give two extreme situations in which the interaction across countries may influence say, democracy and development in others. One is the support that indirectly some rich countries give to say revolutions in very poor countries, with the objective sometimes to get some resources, or the other extreme, I would take the European Union. Then acceding to the European Union is a way of just buying good institutions and then having the possibility of move ahead on the process of developing good institutions and democracy. And then what would be your and last point that is related to this is that's an issue I think is very important for the future of all of us, is that the accession of Turkey to the European Union, of Turkey, your country, to the European Union, then as say a way of showing the countries that are Muslim countries may integrate in the say Western world and then develop and show to the others that these things may work. And then what are your reactions to that?
Okay, let me start with Turkey. After Adam and I had written this paper, and I think a while ago there was the so-called electronic coup in Turkey, where the army put on a website that they will not tolerate the election of the current president, or at least intimated that he was finally elected. But there was a touch-and-go moment. It wasn't clear. People were worried. So some Turkish papers, knowing I'm Turkish, they called me up. They said, well, you seem to have written about this. Will there be a coup or won't there be a coup? So I said, hold on. And I looked at, Adam's numbers, in current dollars, at $10,000 GDP, the probability of a coup is 0. And I looked at Turkey, it's just like $10,000 or 9,990 or something like that. So I said, I don't know. And they said, no, that's not a good answer. You have to give us an answer. So you're the expert, so tell us, And so I took a chance and I said, there won't be a coup. So I was right. Now, the issue of globalization, this is absolutely right. There are, first of all, non-stationarities. I mean, the role of social media. But take Libya. I mean, Libya's coup succeeded. There was revolutionary fervor because social media facilitated it. And then Europe helped along, and the US helped along, maybe in the right direction. And in the past, of course, there are many coups that have been initiated through the states, the other way around. So yes, so you have to worry about those things, and we haven't taken those into account, and nobody does, but you're absolutely right. External interference is a critical issue here, and that is going to muddy up the picture even more. The issue of globalization, however, works, and I tried to allude a little bit to it when I talked about technology diffusion. First of all, social media, ideas about democracy diffuse. Social costs diffuse in the sense that, maybe there was not as much awareness of what's happening in one country if you're in another country. But of course, this has changed. Ability to organize has changed, so it's become easier to have popular uprisings for democracy, say. by a general population. So that's changing the picture. But technology diffusion itself is going to make a huge difference. So one impact of globalization is that growth is going, a significant part of growth depends on technology flows. So the way that is probably going to operate is by accelerating growth rates. To the extent that growth rates accelerate, it's going to make it more likely for countries to transition to democracy. Let's come back to China. How come China has been growing at 7.5% for so many years? It can't be investment. It can't be labor. It can't be innovation. It's just technology adoption. So that, I think, is a highly understudied issue. And to the extent, again, I mean, it goes along with the theory, to the extent that incomes can be raised because of globalization, that is probably going to accelerate the process of democratization. I think, we saw it already happen. I mean, it happened in Korea, it happened in Taiwan, it happens in Singapore. No, it didn't happen in Singapore yet, sorry. I think that is an important component. And these are additional elements. These are sort of outlines of some of the things one focuses, but there are many, many other issues, and that's why it's so difficult to use economic variables alone and explain political outcomes.
Yeah.
Hi. I was just wondering if you could have a word about the international political agenda, let's say, about putting democracy forward in developing countries, and the idea that democracy is going to improve economic growth there. And do you imply by what you said that dictatorship is kind of like a previous necessary step to secure growth and then move towards democracy? Or yeah. I don't know if you can have a word about that.
Yeah. So this is a very pertinent question. Is it worth it to have a dictator, even if it's going to give you economic growth? Was Pinochet worth it after all that he did? So I'm certainly not advocating putting in repressive dictators. But what we do observe is that in certain cases, that's also Glazer's point is that, yes, in some cases, but not in all, dictatorships may enhance the growth rate. Overall, however, what is the relationship, your first question, between democracy and growth or regime and growth? There isn't any, really. There isn't much that you can find about particular regimes and growth. There doesn't seem to be any significant positive component either of democracy or dictatorship. In some countries, you see it. Some countries, it happens. So what can you do? So in terms of an international agenda, should you go and impose democracy on countries? So I don't know. I mean, maybe that once you establish it, it has some persistence and it's a good thing. And, since growth doesn't matter, maybe one can sort of try to do it. But obviously, it doesn't work if you start a war. That's not a very good system. I don't know, will democracy survive in Libya? Who knows? We don't know what's going to happen. And we don't know what's going to happen in Egypt. So just because you have democracy, if the income levels are low, it's not clear it's going to survive. Now, of course, there's some probability that they will. There's, in some cases, a good probability that they will. Whether you should actually go ahead and do it, I don't know, but certainly the European Union decided to do it. It went, in Libya. Yeah, it wasn't a hands-off policy, and the idea is maybe that was a good thing. In certain cases where you sustain the regime that is going to be most beneficial to your own country for selfish reasons, that's not a very good reason to do anything.
Hi, yeah. Does it not also depend on the kind of the dictatorship? Because I read and worked some bit about Spain under Franco, and as I recall, on the first 2 decades, Franco basically tried to close off Spain, and growth was basically non-existent. And only after a change of his policies, when he opened up and tourism kickstarted the economy, it started working out, in terms of economic growth.
Yeah, so that's why, I mean, as I said, I don't think dictatorship, there is a relationship between growth and political regime. And it does depend, I suppose, on the kind of democracy. And there's no dictatorship, and there's no guarantee you're going to get the right kind. And even if, it's well-intentioned, it might backfire. The prominent example was the Soviet Union. They did the wrong thing. So it's not clear that political regime necessarily will improve growth. And if you can come up with a classification and say there's a certain kind that is going to promote it, but, it's iffy. Which kind? Right now we say, pro-market dictatorships may be helpful if, I don't know, China is the example. So it's a good question. I mean, I know there's a whole literature on sort of the kind of autocratic regimes that will be more successful in promoting growth, but I have little to say on that. All I know is, it's not given that it's going to help.
Okay, it's getting late, so even though there's, I'm sure, many pending questions, we're going to finish here. So thank you, Professor Benhabib, again, for this very inspiring and thoughtful.